I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. And we include your questions and comments and cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely, stimulating topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. Our guest this episode is New York Times best-selling Canadian-British award-winning author, blogger, and journalist Cory Doctorow, author of such books as Little Brother, Homeland, Makers, and Down and Out the Magic Kingdom, and more recently, Red Tea Blues, The Lost Cause, The Internet Con, and The Bezel. He served as co-editor of the blog Boing Boing, and he is a visiting professor of computer science at Open University. I'll ask him about that. Visiting professor of practice at the University of North Carolina School of Library and Information Science, and co-founder of the UK Open Rights Group. Let me welcome Cory Doctorow to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And a pleasure to have you here. And I'd like to begin, actually, by asking you about how you're often identified, Canadian-British or British-Canadian. I don't know which comes first and why. We did a podcast recently with Malcolm Gladwell, and he has the same identity. It's an interesting and unique hybrid identity in many ways, but is there any loyalty to one side or the other?
Well, actually, I've got a third passport now, too. I'm Canadian, British, and American, and I'm working on Polish, which would get me back into the EU, which is something I lost after Brexit. So I was born and raised in Canada to Polish and Russian refugees, hence the Polish. I moved to the UK to be the European director of a nonprofit human rights group called the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who I've worked with for about a quarter of a century, and married a woman who was British, fathered a daughter who was British, and eventually became British for lots of reasons, not least that if you're going to live somewhere, you should have rights. And the UK has seen a steady drumbeat of hostility to migrants, and I was keenly aware that I was in a precarious position, though less precarious than other kinds of migrants, and that the more rights I could get, the better. A similar dynamic was at play in my decision after we moved here in 2015 to seek American naturalization. This is a country whose hostility to migrants has only gone up during my lifetime. And the rights that you have as a permanent resident, like a green card holder, are very fragile and governed mostly by norms and not by law, as we saw during the Muslim ban, when Trump's immigration guards held green card holders in immigration detention, denied them access to counsel, and said that they would only release them if they voluntarily signed papers giving up their permanent residency status. And these were people with decades in the country, families, businesses, homes, and so on. And so becoming a citizen makes sense, irrespective of loyalties, irrespective of feeling. It makes sense if you care about your own human rights.
Well, I've just applied for Canadian citizenship, but it's been held up for a long time. I'm entitled to it because my mother was born in London, right, Ontario, and yet the process has been a very slow one. I just wanted it for sort of a number of odd reasons.
I think it behooves everyone who can to get it, because Canada has also had significant hostility to migrants, and the possibility that your entitlement to naturalization will be revoked by far-right government as a piece of red meat theater for other people, for their base, it goes up every year. And so get it now before they take it away. It's much harder to take away your citizenship than it is to take away your right to become a citizen at some future date.
Well, we're talking now to Cory Doctorow, the activist, and I want to get into some of these issues that have been very important to you. But before I do, your sense of what genre you most identify with. Now, we're talking about nationality and migrant identity, but you've been certainly characterized as a young adult writer, or just a writer in general, or a science fiction writer. What do you see yourself as, mainly?
Well, certainly, like, my background is as a science fiction writer. I grew up in a really charmed milieu in that in Toronto in the 1980s, we had an American exile, a woman named Judith Merrill, who left the country after the Chicago police riots, who had done, among other things, served as the host of Doctor Who on public television, where she would recount the tropes that went in and the stories of them. You know, like, tonight's show is about time loops, and I remember we invented time loops at the Futurian House in 1939 during a potluck dinner. And she would sort of do these great little shticks. But she also founded the science fiction reference library that now bears her name. It used to be called the Spaced Out Library, but after she gave us permission, we renamed it the Merrill Collection. It's the largest science fiction reference collection in the world. She was writer in residence at that library, and she invited anyone to bring her stories. So this is like, to be very Canadian about it, like Wayne Gretzky inviting you to come down and practice your slap shot with him. And so from the time I was about 10, I was giving her stories. She had also helped convince a local fan to start what's now the oldest science fiction bookstore in the world, where I ended up working after buying the first book I ever bought for myself there, and I worked there for many years. She started a social gathering for science fiction professionals called Toronto Hydra. We used to all get together every 6 weeks for beer and schmoozing, and that in that way I became widely professionally connected. And she even convinced some fans out west to start the first science fiction magazine in Canada, On Spec, who bought my first story. And so I had the closest thing that there ever was to a formal apprenticeship to become a science fiction writer. But, since then I have written more than 30 books. The youngest audience I've written for is toddlers. I've written a picture book called Posey the Monster Slayer. I have books for middle grades and young adult readers. I have many novels for adults. And I've published nonfiction on a variety of topics, mostly tech policy. And these are aimed at young adults and adults.
Where do you come by all your tech knowledge? I mean, it's all over the place in so much of your writing.
Well, I often tell college students who ask me how to get a career in tech, that if they don't have the self-discipline and foresight to be born in 1971, I can't help them. It was a good year to be born, to grow up in tech. My dad was a computer scientist, so, I got a slightly earlier start than many others. He started bringing home terminals connected to mainframes at the university in the mid-70s with just printers, no screens. My mom, who was a kindergarten teacher then, used to smuggle out whole rolls of paper towel from the bathroom, the kids' bathroom, and we would print 1,000 feet up one side, 1,000 feet up the other, roll them back up and put them back in the bathroom for the kids to dry their hands on. And that was how I started computing. But Are you saying
your mother was a smuggler? Do I have that right?
She was a smuggling kindergarten teacher who trafficked in contraband paper towels that were borrowed long enough to, imbue them with some printer ink and then were returned to serve as hand towels again. And then, in 1979, we got an Apple II Plus, and I grew up with those and modems. And then, by the time I was at the University of Waterloo and about to drop out, anyone who was a warm body who knew anything about programming could get a job. And I had submitted an undergraduate thesis proposal to Waterloo, asking them to do something on sort of deviant sociology in the nascent networked internet, and that I wanted to do it all as a hypertext project with hot links and so on CD-ROM. And they said no. They said they wanted it on 25-pound bond, double spaced, and I got a job offer from Voyager, which was the hottest multimedia publisher in the world, in New York, which was the hottest city for a young Torontonian. As they say, it takes 2 Torontonians to change a light bulb, one to change it and one to go to New York and make sure light bulbs are still cool. And so it was like, stay at uni, pay them a lot of money, not make multimedia, go to New York, get paid more than I'd ever made, make multimedia for the predominant leading company in the world. And from there, I got into web development, and then I did a software startup, and then I left all that to work for a nonprofit on tech and human rights. And spent 25 years at really the center of that fight. I was a delegate to several UN specialized agencies. I lobbied the Brussels Parliament and the British Parliament. I was in 31 countries in 3 years. I did comments for many of the expert agencies and had ex parte meetings with their leadership and their technologists. I advised many startups and, did many stints as an academic at various universities. And so really just kind of grew up with it. So started at a time when both tech and policy were very legible and sort of primitive. You could hold them in your hands. And as they disappeared into more baroque, opaque, complex and abstract systems, I just sort of was around as that happened. So I even when I encounter stuff that's not formally stuff I've been trained on, I can kind of recognize the substrate that it's sitting on and what constraints and capabilities that imbues it with, and what policy challenges that's likely to give rise to.
You doubtlessly have one of the longest CVs of anybody that I'm familiar with. especially anybody who's dropped out 4 times. Why all the dropouts of colleges?
Well, this is down to really top-notch secondary education. So I went to weird hippie alternative schools, and including weird hippie alternative secondary school. And the school that I landed up at was called Seed School. And you can tell it was founded in 1969 because SEED stands for Self-Exploration, Education, and Discovery. And it was originally founded as a school without teachers. It was a bid by the Toronto School Board to get hippie dropout kids to just show up at a building every day. Among them was Marshall McLuhan's son. And then by the time I was there, we had a half dozen teachers and about 80 kids, and you designed your own curriculum and studied anything you wanted, including nothing. You could do nothing and continue to be enrolled. You could design courses that no one could teach, and then you could go find someone in the community to teach it and then work with them to develop a kind of rigorous assessment program for it that would be overseen by the teachers. So
this is right out of the Summerhill playbook.
A lot of the kids went to Summerhill inspired elementary schools, including me. There was a lot of Waldorf and Summerhill. There was also a lot of people who just had completely failed in the traditional education system. And it was that or dropping out. So it was quite an interesting mix, right? Of kids whose parents were kind of into radical pedagogy and kids who just didn't fit in. Often kids from lower socioeconomic status. So it was quite a cool and interesting mix. My parents were definitely into radical pedagogy. My parents both ended up with doctors of education. They oversee doctoral candidates in education. They're the first people in their family really to be literate. My grandfather was a refugee and my grandmother, and on the other side, my grandfather dropped out at 12 to support his family when his dad died, and my grandmother basically never read a book. And so, my parents, who both have doctorates in education, for them this was really important. And so I ended up at high school, at this great high school that was run like a grad school, right? If any of that sounds familiar, it's that's how a master's program runs, right? Where you're designing your own curriculum and going out in the community and figuring out what you want to study. And I liked it so much, I stayed for 7 years to get a 4-year diploma. And then I went to undergrad. And undergrad, it felt like a huge step back. It was very rigid. It was clear that in some cases it was oriented around winnowing people out of highly selective programs. So at University of Toronto, I was in an artificial intelligence program. This was in the early 90s, where the incoming class was a couple hundred students, and the graduating class, which had to do a thesis project, was about 12 students, because that's how much capacity there was for oversight of their theses. And so everything in between was about winnowing people out. So, being forced to spend money to do calculus for finance majors as just a thing is kind of a hazing ritual to see if they could get me to change majors. That was a step beyond. And so I just, I dropped out of York, U of T, Waterloo, Michigan State, and never looked back. And, thankfully this was the time when tuition was cheap. This was I'm not a boomer, I'm an Xer, but even I was able to pay my tuition and bills with a part-time job. And so I could drop out without ruining my life. As the father of a 16-year-old who's going to high school or university next year, looking at tuition at some of the schools that she wants to apply to that ranges to $95,000 a year, I'm a lot less sanguine about her trying it out for a year and then dropping out if it's not to her liking. Not because I don't think that's a valid thing to do, but because $95,000 of debt or $400,000 of debt is a millstone around your neck that lasts for the rest of your life.
Well said, which prompts me to ask you, before we start talking about your work and some other things, including maybe some prognostications, and get into some of the depths of what you have pretty much decidedly put yourself behind in the way of ideological struggles, so to speak. Izzy L. Doctorow, who I had the privilege of interviewing a number of times, and I'm a great admirer of, one of our great American novelists, author of Ragtime and Billy Bathgate and Book of Daniel, just to name a few. Is he your third cousin once removed, or actually no relation?
As far as we can tell, there's no relation. My folks met him once and asked him about it, and he's like, well, So Doctorow is it's an anglicization of Doctorowicz. And so presumably that happened to him at Ellis Island, or his family, and it happened to my family in Halifax when my grandfather and father came over. Doctorowicz is just one of those synthetic tax collector names that the Tsar's tax collectors gave to Jews because so-and-so, son of such and such, was not specific enough. There were too many people who were Moshe, son of Justin or something. And so they couldn't tell who'd paid their taxes. So they went around and gave people last names. This happened in Germany too. It's actually happened in lots of places. Like
they gave them a lot of colors, like silver and gold.
Yeah, that's more Prussian than Russian, but there was a lot of Goldstein, Silverstein. But this is also why you have the 100 old names in China, Li and Feng and whatever. It's also the king's tax collectors. It's why there is such a clutch of extremely common Korean last names. It's also tax collectors. A lot of what we think of as last names are actually administrative conveniences. So we asked him, are your Doktorowiczes from the same part of Belarus/Poland that our Doktorowiczes are from? And he was like, yeah, kind of, we think, but there is like an important sense in which like most Jews are second or third cousins because of the genetic bottlenecks that we went through the diasporas, at least most Ashkenazis, which is why like there's, genetic tests for Tay-Sachs when we fall in love and make a baby because we're likely making a baby with a relative that's not that distant. But, we're not like related.
All children of Abraham, as someone once said to me. Let's talk about your career, though. I mean, where does the prolificity come from? We've talked about where your technology knowledge comes from, but the drive, to keep turning out as many books as you've turned out is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I wrote 9 books during lockdown. So I think that it's a not entirely healthy impulse, and I relate it to my own physical health. I have had pretty significant and worsening chronic pain problems since I was a teenager. And the times when I don't notice the pain is when I'm doing something else, right? It's like when I lie down in bed and stop distracting myself with other stuff that I really notice the pain.
So you're not feeling pain now that we're engaged in a conversation?
Yeah, engaged in a conversation, fine. When I get up from this chair, I'm going to be in like non-trivial amounts of pain because I won't have noticed it. And psychologically, I have the same coping mechanism. When I'm stressed or upset or worried about the state of the world or about the state of my immediate life, I just sit down and write. And on top of that, I sold my first novel while I was working at a startup that I'd helped found that was very busy. And then I went to work for EFF as their European director, and I was even busier. And my first novel was successful, and my publisher wanted a second and a third, and I had to write those while doing this job. And I had this realization that there were days when I felt like the writing I was doing was great, and there were days when I felt like the writing I was doing was awful. And sometimes, in retrospect, I could look at the work and say some of this is great and some of this is awful, but they weren't correlated, right? The most significant predictor of whether I felt my writing was terrible is like if I felt terrible, right? Did I have a fight with my girlfriend? Was I getting my ass kicked at the UN? Was I horribly jet lagged? Had I just had something, had I just had my suitcase stolen, right? That would make me feel like my writing was terrible. And when I had that realization, I kind of was able to cultivate that into a discipline that says that like, even on days when the writing feels terrible, I should just write because maybe it's terrible and maybe it's not, but I won't know until significantly after the fact. And so I cultivated this ability to do this. And because I'm not all that smart, thankfully, it took like a decade for me to realize the corollary, which is that on the days when I feel really good about my writing, maybe it's terrible. And by that point, I'd already gotten in the habit. And so, under normal circumstances, if I'm working on a book, I pick a page count. I just finished a book for Farrar Strauss Giroux on platform decay called enshittification, which is this funny word I made up. And I did 3 pages a day, 5 days a week for, I forget, like 3.5 months and turned the book in bang on time. And I can do that because even on days when I feel like I'm writing terribly, I can just write it. And now I'm going through and doing the rewrites and it's fine. Some of it's really good. Some of it needs a little work. Most of it is just fine. It's recognizable Cory Doctorow product,
Well, you're a name, and you have a global readership, and you have had, some pretty extraordinary success. You're also often, from time to time, described as a didactic writer. Does that suit you, or do you like that, or
Entirely.
Do you reject it?
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to have that. So first of all, I think that when there's nothing wrong with pursuing argument by mode of fiction rather than by rhetoric, right?
Except some would say, why not put it into essay form as opposed to telling stories? Right?
I think that they are confusing an or for an and. You should do both, and indeed, I would say that most writers who claim not to be trying to convey something about their view of the world are kidding themselves or you. But also, look, I don't think we know why fiction works. Fiction at its core is a very weird thing, right? Because you have these like involuntary limbic responses to the imaginary plights of people who don't exist, which is like just a weird thing. Like the most tragic death in fiction, like the Romeo and Juliet, is like less tragic than the death of the yogurt you had for breakfast, because at least that yogurt was alive and now it's dead. And Romeo and Juliet never lived, never died. And in some really important fundamental sense, they do not matter. And yet you cry, you laugh, and all these other things happen. And I think when we read fiction that works, we're like, this fiction is just landing for me. And maybe we come up with some kind of cod theories about why, but we don't really know. And when fiction doesn't work, and especially like in the context of a critique where you're a writing teacher or you're in a critiquing circle or you're an editor and you're trying to make something better, you may stumble on something, right? You may go, this is the point where I feel like it's not working for me. But that doesn't mean that that's not the part that's not working, right? If a scene in which the character is kind of mulling their plight is not working for you, it may not be that the problem is that they're spending too much time introspecting. It may be that like earlier on in the book, you fail to do the thing that would connect the reader with the character so intensely that introspection carries the moment, right? You might be missing something else. And I think that when we try to critique work in order to make it better, what we're really doing is we're running down a checklist of things that are hard, right? So writing good, discursive, non-narrative text is hard. It's easier to make people engaged with the imaginary doings of people who don't matter if you're describing stuff they're doing instead of like describing the ideas they have or the world they're in or whatever. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. And when it lands, it's great. There's a 6,000 word sequence in Neil Stephenson's novel Cryptonomicon that's just about how his character eats Captain Crunch cereal. And I know that sounds ridiculous. It is one of the best pieces of discursive writing I've ever read. I would read like a whole book just composed of that. It is so good. And it's hard to do. But when you do it, it's great. It's as good as anything else that makes fiction good. And so there is nothing intrinsically wrong with discursive fiction or didactic fiction. It's just that doing it in a way that isn't bad is hard. And, if you don't like my books, maybe the reason is that I didn't do those things well enough. But I can attest that there is a substantial number of readers for whom the discursiveness is a feature and not a bug, and for whom it lands in a way that is aesthetically pleasing, not just like politically pleasing, but aesthetically pleasing in the way that good fiction is.
And fiction has its own truths. Sometimes it transcends the truths that we can put rhetorically or that we can expository express ourselves. The breakthrough book, I guess, for you in some ways was Little Brother. It's about team gamers organizing resistance power. It's about dangers and risks of the police state. It's about many different things, but it's a dystopian novel in many ways and certainly could be described as a kind of didactic novel. But for the most part, it established you as a writer. It's kind of a guerrilla technology novel. I'm trying to categorize it. I'm being very careful about that because I don't like these categorizations and because they have to be qualified all the time. But I wondered just about the birth of Marcus Yellow. This is maybe somewhat distant in your mind because you've written many books since then, including a business book, a nonfiction book, which I should give a plug for as well. But where did he come from? I mean, he lived in San Francisco and emerged into your consciousness, obviously. What gave birth to him?
So I'll say first that I don't think it's dystopian. I'll say that I think it has dystopian furniture. So for me, a dystopia is not a world in which things go wrong. Like the second law of thermodynamics is not up for debate. Things fall apart.
Entropy.
Yeah. But believing that things will go wrong doesn't make you a pessimist. And failing to believe that things don't go wrong doesn't make you an optimist. It makes you, a danger to yourself and others, because that's the thinking that says we don't need lifeboats on the Titanic. So
forgive me for interrupting here.
Yeah.
We'll veer off for just a moment if we could, because before, I'm not giving anything away here or speaking out of turn, I don't think you talked about, we chatted a little before we went on live, and you talked about the collapse of civilization. And I thought maybe there's something Blakean in his mind, that is prophetic that I need to explore with him, and he can divulge to me.
So everything runs down eventually. So for me, the dystopian or pessimistic view is not that things will go wrong. It's that we won't be able to set them right again. And so, I take my view from writers like Rebecca Solnit and her wonderful history book, A Paradise Built in Hell, which is, a closely accounted history of disasters and about how people pulled together during them, from the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco to the quake.
In some ways, a very hopeful book.
Yeah, I think in every way a hopeful book, because it is not hopeful to say nothing will go wrong, therefore everything will be fine. It is hopeful to say when things go wrong, as they do, as they will, as they always have, we will be able to fix them. That is, for me, the beating heart of hope. And, Little Brother is a novel of teen rebellion, but it's a novel of successful teen rebellion.
Yeah.
And so, the idea that the state will overreach and spy on us and abuse its power is not dystopian. It's merely historically accurate and factually observed. But the idea that we can fight back against it, that is very hopeful. And as to where it came from, it has, like, books have a lot of different origin points, right? There's rarely, sometimes there's like a crystallizing point, but it crystallizes a bunch of things that have gone in to the writer's hopper. And, for me, my hopper has always been blogs. I started blogging 25 years ago. I was one of the co-owners and co-founders of Boing Boing. These days, I'm still one of the
Is that from Gerald McBoing Boing, by the way?
No, it's a weird story, but my co-founder, Mark Fraunfelder, and his wife, Carla Sinclair, who founded the predecessor to it, which was a magazine called Boing Boing that I used to sell in the bookstore. Her mother used to throw bread rolls at her father when he came home drunk. She would stand at the top of the stairs and throw them down the stairs, and when they hit him, she would go boing, boing, boing. That is the story they swear is at the origin of the name. Anyway, as a blogger, the way that I metabolize everything that happens in my life is not by like putting in a little commonplace book, which, when I make notes for myself, not only can I not read my handwriting, but if I can decipher it, the notes are so cryptic that I can never make any sense of them. But rather, I write the stuff up that seems important to me for strangers and try to figure out why it's important. And doing that is a really excellent discipline. It makes all of those notes extremely mnemonic and sticky. And so they just sort of float around in your brain like a supersaturated solution of fragmentary ideas, and they can stick together and nucleate and crystallize into like a whole novel. And I wrote Little Brother in 8 weeks. It really just crystallized, like bam. And also, the blog itself is like a literal database, right? There's like a MySQL database sitting behind your WordPress installation. You can search it for everything you've ever written about everything you've ever thought. And so here I am with 60,000 blog posts under my belt. And, I write whole books sometimes in a matter of weeks by pulling on all of those ideas that I've been developing without knowing that they were research for a book, right? I'm always researching books that I don't know what the subject will be, because the subject emerges out of this kind of assiduous public note-taking.
Well, there's a nascent element in this that obviously plays in as well, that you're not necessarily even all that aware of, I presume.
Yeah, it's an emergent property of all of this, like, oh, that seems important. And, one of the things that I've started doing, well, now it's like 10 years on, is I go every morning through my old blog posts and I pull up the posts now from 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and this day last year. And I make a little list with links of the headlines from those days that seem important. And this is like if you're working dough and at the edge of the dough it's getting kind of crumbly and dried out, and you fold it back into the middle of the dough. So you're taking all the stuff that's fallen out of your attention and you're folding it back into the middle of your attention. You have this kind of like continuous now of everything you've ever thought. So the past is always present in your life. It's quite an exciting way to pull things together, and all it takes is that you do it for 20 years. So it's although it pays dividends, I think from the day one, the dividends grow by the year. And that's my pitch for blogging. As to the proximate inciting incident, it's pretty mean in that we went to see a techno thriller movie. My friend and mentor Bruce Sterling says a techno thriller is a science fiction novel with the president in it, and techno thrillers tend to have really weak scientific coherence or technical coherence, which is funny because they're technical. And in this one, there was all this stuff that just like are the real like bottom of the barrel technical nonsense, like we have to crack the mainframe, but it has encryption that's rated for 15 minutes. We've only got 14 minutes, so we somehow have to figure out how to speed up the decryption. And none of that like makes any sense. Like every word in that MacGuffin is wrong and doesn't hang together. And what's more, like, audiences are just more technical every year and just have like direct lived experience of technology. And finally, like, people who write those movies get paid so much more than I do. And so, we're walking out of this movie and I'm just like consumed with resentment and just seething with it. And I thought, I ranted to my then girlfriend, now extremely patient wife, that there are far more interesting, consequential, and sort of plot forward cool stories to tell that are grounded in the things technology can and can't do than in the imagined constraints and capabilities of technology from people who hold their audiences in total contempt. And so that was the origin of this. What if you told a tightly plotted techno thriller where the technology was real? And that's turned out to be an extremely winning formula, both commercially and artistically, but also in terms of the effect on the world. So, most years I speak at the DEF CON hacker conference in Vegas, and I have lost count of the number of people who've come up to me and said, I work in information security today because I read Little Brother in high school or middle school. And the ethos of Little Brother, which is about organizing technology so that it serves the people who use it rather than enlisting the people to serve the technology and its masters, that is what informs all of my work. And so I've created a botnet of ethical hackers through this narrative trick that is out there kind of trying to make the world a better place. Like it's one of my proudest legacies.
No, you have a lot to be proud of, and congratulations, deservedly. We're getting a lot of questions for you, and I want to give them full breadth as much as we can here, because there's a lot that I want to go into with you as well. But first, before we go to the questions that are coming in, I wanted to ask you about science fiction in a general way, because my background is very strongly literary, and I had to deal with colleagues in literature departments and fellow scholars who were very snobbish about science fiction, an attitude that I never quite understood. But I was thinking about great science fiction, and there's always that triumvirate that's often cited. I give certain deference to people like Bradbury, but it's often Asimov and Heinlein.
I like Heineken. That's very funny.
I like
That's
Heineken
great.
too. You can drink it.
Yeah.
Interesting Freudian slip. Or as our last podcast with Jungian psychiatrist Tom Singer said, Jungian slip. And then there's Arthur Clarke, too, who fits in. But I still think the best science fiction novel in my hierarchy remains Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness for so many reasons. Do you have one that's on the top of yours?
I'm one of those people who thinks that having a favorite book is really dangerous, because so often it's like Mein Kampf or the Bible.
Even if it's one of yours?
Even if it's one of mine, right? Like, you should read 100 books and love them all for 100 reasons. That said, there's a writer who, like, I will read all day long every day, who isn't one of the ones that most people have heard of, although maybe NPR listeners have. He's a writer called Daniel Pinkwater, who was on NPR for many years as a commentator. He's
I know his work. I know him and his work.
Yeah, me too. So this is the other thing, is that I've now, like, one of the cool things when I look at pictures of me at 15, like at science fiction conventions, volunteering as a gopher, is how many of the writers that I loved back then are now peers, colleagues, and friends. And Daniel's one of them. Daniel is a writer's writer, but he's also like just a romp of a writer. But like, you ask writers about Daniel Pinkwater, and if they know his work, they light up. Because he does things that should be impossible. The way that he tells stories should not work. And boy, do they ever work. They're funny, they're weird, they're provocative. These are, kids' stories for the most part. He's mostly a YA and kids writer, although he's written for all ages, including like memoir.
He's a very entertaining writer, ultimately.
Yeah. But also, like, there's a lot going on. He's not just entertaining because he's funny. Right, like Steve Martin had a book called Pointy Shoes that were just a bunch of absurdist essays that are super entertaining. You can read them all day long, but you don't come away from them changing the way you think or see the world. Right, Pinkwater, like, I am the weirdo that I am today because I picked up Alan Mendelsohn, The Boy from Mars, when I was 12 years old, and I've read all 100+ books that he's written since, and most of them several times, and he is he's a gift to the human race. I don't know how else to put it. And there are lots of other writers I love. And like, if Daniel and 10 other writers I could name were like in a burning building and I could only save one of them, they'd all die because I'd be running from one to the next, not able to make up my mind. But boy, is he a writer I wish more people read. That's the bookseller in me, right?
You've given him a great endorsement, and that's good PR. And he's a good guy, so it's nice to hear.
Yeah.
And here are some questions for you. Let me see if I can get through some of these, and then we'll go back to talking about some of the things that I want to raise. But I did want to raise a lot of issues with you that are being raised by people sending questions in. This is Darren from Tacoma, Washington, who, thanks for the question, Darren, says, how do you think emerging technologies like AI and blockchain can either reinforce or dismantle monopolistic power structures?
I think both AI, I'm sorry, with all due respect, I think both AI and blockchain are nonsense. I don't think that they're going to have any effect on decentralization. I think that the talk of blockchain doing decentralization was interesting, and there are people involved in that movement whose hearts are in the right place, but all evidence is that the blockchain does nothing to decentralize anything. That when you look at blockchain distributions on power distributions on successful blockchains, they're highly concentrated and no one's really found a use for them, including as a DAO that stands up to any even cursory scrutiny. It's a speculative instrument. It's a way to sucker normies into paying off insiders, and it's a way to launder money. And AI is just spicy autocomplete. It's just yet another investment bubble, one that will probably leave very little behind. Some investment bubbles leave some pretty cool stuff behind, even if they're terrible. So Web 2.0 or Web 1.0 left behind 1 million former humanities undergrads who'd been taught HTML and Perl and Python, and that's where we got a much more humane and interesting web. And WorldCom, which was a horrible fraud, left behind a lot of fiber in the ground that's now being lit up, a lot of it with the bipartisan infrastructure money. But like Enron left behind nothing. And that's what blockchain and AI are going to leave behind. They're going to leave behind like bad JPEGs, bad Austrian economics, bad statistical inferences, and a lot of systems that will have been integrated with foundation models that can't be sustained, but and that are gone, but that you can't rip out of the system. It's going to be like asbestos in the walls.
There's a question for you from Pleasant, California, from Susan, and we thank you for the question, Susan. And I should mention that Cory Doctorow has been identified for quite some time as an activist and an advocate for changing the copyright laws. And she says, what kind of changes would you prioritize to make copyright more equitable for creators? You've been identified with, Creative Commons in very strong ways.
Yeah. So I think that copyright has surprisingly little utility for creative workers, given its reputation as a tool for it. And the reason for that is that while copyright is something you can bargain with the forces of capital with as a worker, it doesn't give you bargaining power. So if you have something you can bargain with, but you don't have power, then more of it doesn't make you richer, or it just means the people you bargain with just take away whatever you have. So if you give writers like another 40 years of copyright, it's just going to add 40 years to the term that publishers expect writers to sign over. If you give them the right to control who can train AI on their works, it's just going to be added to the rights that publishers demand. And those publishers will then go ahead and train AIs and try to displace writers with them, because the people who have means, motive, and opportunity to fire writers and financially benefit from it are publishers, right? They're not our friends in the AI fights. But there are...
Excuse me, Cory, you had a particularly special arrangement with Tor Books, though, didn't you, for years?
Yeah, that let me do Creative Commons. And, this is it's kind of a testament to the difference between the institution and its personnel. So the personnel were very much behind it, but publishing as an institution is not super friendly to writers. I mean, notoriously, right? Every writer who's had their royalties stolen by a publisher. That's the only person who can steal your royalties, right? Your readers can't steal your royalties. The bookstore can't steal your royalties. Only the publisher can steal your royalties. And so, all of the wage theft in the creative industries come from the creative industrialists. Now, there are things that balance this out. So one is just labor rights. We saw this with screenwriters and with actors, where they have what's called sectoral bargaining. This is a remnant of the New Deal. Sectoral bargaining has mostly been banned by the Taft-Hartley Act, but sectoral bargaining means that as freelance writers, you can set a standard contract across all the studios. If we had sectoral bargaining in publishing or in illustration or in other fields, we could do what those writers did. Those writers won a huge victory after going out on strike. And it wasn't the only one they'd won. They had just come off another victory where they got the highly concentrated talent agency industry, which was ripping them off like crazy, and brought them to their knees. These huge firms owned by massive private equity funds that held out for 4 years in some cases. They brought the whole sector, or it's 2 years, I beg your pardon, brought the whole sector to its knees and got everything they asked for, as they did with the writer's strike. So sectoral bargaining for unions is a good one. There is something in the 1976 Copyright Act that's hugely beneficial to creative workers, but could be improved. It's something called the termination transfer right. So in the 1976 Act, writers and all other creative workers are entitled to file paperwork with the Copyright Office after 35 years and say, whatever contractual arrangement I have with my publisher, my studio, or my label, no matter what term it extends for, I'm unilaterally canceling it and taking back my rights. So Stephen King, his first couple of books, he got really crummy deals on them. After 35 years, even though he'd signed perpetual contracts, he was able to cancel those deals and reissue those books, resell those books. All the Babysitter's Club books have gone through this. All the Sweet Valley High books, the early Dean Koontz books. All of the Marvel founders did this. Stan Lee's estate just got Disney to pay them again for Marvel, as did Ditko and Kirby. These are things that affect the material outcomes of creative workers. It's a thing that puts more money in your pockets rather than giving you more excuses to be outraged. And we could make it 20 years. It was originally supposed to be 20 years in the 76 Act, and it was originally supposed to be automatic. Unless you file paperwork to continue your arrangement, your rights automatically terminated and reverted. We could do that. And if we did that, living writers, not just dead writers, and not just writers who are lucky enough to be still successful 35 years after their first works are sold, those living writers and other creative workers could be getting their money back. That would be a massive one. And then one more is...
How's that going to happen, though? I mean, realistically.
Well, we got it in the 1976 Act. We got it in the 1976 Act because creative workers successfully advocated against the interests of publishers. The way that you organize workers to advocate against their bosses is not a lost secret of a fallen civilization. It's not like embalming pharaohs, right? You organize workers, and then you use those workers to bring power to bear against lawmakers. And
through unions or?
Yeah, unions. Well, unions and workers organized into guilds and so on. Remember, the only reason we have unions today that are legal and formal is because we had unions when they were illegal and informal, right? When you could go to prison for organizing a union. Yeah. You don't have to organize a union according to the rules. And this is going to be really important over the next 4 years, because they're going to put, I don't know, like Boss Tweed or something in charge of the National Labor Relations Board. We don't have to play by the rules. The rules sucked anyways, right? Like, we haven't had, sectoral bargaining since Taft-Hartley. I think that was 1935. The rules have sucked for a long time. Throw away the rules. Just unionize. And risk arrest and do all the other things you need to do. These are not lost arts, we know how to do this. There are people alive today who learn their union organizing from the union organizers of the era in which union organizing was a crime, and where union organizers were kidnapped and beaten and sometimes murdered and left in shallow graves. We know how to do this. We got to do it again. So one final thing that we could do at the state level, which is a lot easier than federal organizing, I wrote a book about this called Choke Point Capitalism with Rebecca Giblin, about the way that creative workers get stolen from by monopolies, both in the tech and entertainment sector. And we zeroed in this book. We the last half of the book is all solutions, shovel-ready ideas, policy ideas. But we zeroed in on one that was royalty theft. And we talked to a firm of accountants here in LA that had done tens of thousands of audits of record label contracts over decades. And in all of those audits, they had found one case of an error that benefited the musician, and every other error they found only benefited the label, which you have to assume is like some very frustrating, highly localized probability storm that makes things very hard for their CPAs. And here's the thing, right? When you go to your label or your publisher or anyone else who's stealing from you, and you say, you stole from me, they say, well, you know what? You creative workers, you're adorable, but you can't do math, and you're sadly mistaken. We never stole from you, but we're good-natured slobs. So to make you whole, we're going to offer you a discount, half the money you think we owe you, and all you have to do to get it is sign a non-disclosure agreement, and also your auditor has to promise never to audit us again because they know where we buried the bodies. Otherwise, you can try suing us, but we've got millions of dollars. How many dollars do you have? Oh, that's right. We stole all your dollars, so you have none. And so they had been signing these non-disclosures. Now, contract is a matter of state law, and we have lots of things in state law that are unconscionable and cannot be included in a contract. Like, you can't sign a non-compete in California. It's against the state constitution. Your employer puts it in there. It's actually illegal to put it in there, but even if they do and you sign it, it's not enforceable. We could make non-disclosure when it pertains to royalty theft, to failed audits. We could make non-disclosure illegal. And at the stroke of a pen, we will put more money in the pockets of more creative workers than every copyright reform in the last 40 years, right? This is a crack in the machine. You stick a crowbar in it, wiggle around. Money pours out of it into the pockets of creative workers.
Yeah, non-disclosure agreements also protect so many people from, charges of sexual harassment or sexual transgression or things of that sort. I wonder, maybe I'm thinking about one of your earlier novels, Makers, where these kids come up with a new economic system. Maybe that's what we really need.
Yeah.
You're a cauldron of creativity. Maybe you can lead us or find the pathway for us. But let me go to another question from Hank in Tampa, Florida, who says, are there any emerging trends or technologies you are particularly excited about?
Yeah, there are a few. So repairable laptops, which is not a thing I would have thought was going to become super mainstream. But a couple of years ago, a company called Framework, a US company, built a laptop that is about the size and weight of a MacBook, except that it's got 6 captive screws on the bottom and it comes with a screwdriver, and you take the base off and every part has got a QR code, and you point your phone at it and it tells you how to replace that part and gives you a link to click to order it. You can upgrade any component of it. I've had one for like 3 years. It is literally the best laptop I've ever owned. I've upgraded the motherboard 3 times. They'll give you either sell you a ready-made case or give you a 3D printing file so you can print a case for it and make it into a bookshelf PC. When they upgraded the battery, they added like 20% capacity to the battery. They came up with a case that you could put the old battery in and use it as a power bank. I broke the screen when I was on tour in the UK. I was in Edinburgh. I got out of a cab and I dropped it, and only this little thin wedge of the screen was visible. I was just barely able to use the laptop, and the usable part of the screen kept getting smaller and smaller. And I called up the manufacturer and I just begged them, please, I'm going to be in London tomorrow. FedEx a new screen to me. I'll pay anything. So they FedEx the screen. I get off the train at King's Cross at like midnight. I go down to my hotel in Clerkenwell, check in. There's the screen waiting for me at midnight. Tired, exhausted. I changed the screen. It took me 15 minutes. I'd never done it before. And the next morning I was able to do 2 live casts and write a column, right? So this is just like amazing. I've never owned a laptop long enough that the stickers actually wore off. This thing's got like 3 layers of stickers on it now. It's an incredible piece of hardware. So that's one thing I'm really excited about. The other one is home pharmaceutical production. So I was at DEF CON this summer and I saw a group of people called the Four Thieves Vinegar Collective, who are rogue pharmaceutical chemists, demo a machine they made. So if you go to a compounding pharmacy and you order a drug. Most of the Ozempic right now is being made in compounding pharmacies. Someone who's got very little training goes to this robot that's got a bunch of peristaltic pumps that feed a small jar with a Teflon paddle that's in a larger jar that's full of water that's attached to a pump that has a piezoelectric heater and cooler. And it just doses little blobs of reagent and precursor from those peristaltic pumps into the inner jar while stirring them, and the outer jar is keeping it at a constant temperature while it stirs. The starter ones of those that you learn on, which you can't really use to synthesize compounds, are like $5,000, and then the real ones are like 50. So they've made a DIY version for $500, and they fed all of the chemical synthesis literature to an LLM, and it's like a glorified search engine, and you can give it the code for a molecule. If you go to Wikipedia, there's a thing called a SMILE code that describes every small organic molecule. And you paste it in, and it says these are the kind of common reagents and precursors that you need, and you feed them into the gadget, and then you press go, and then it just makes stuff. And what you get is a solution. You put it through a coffee filter, you wait for the residue to dry, you put it in a pill press or whatever. So on stage, after describing this and after building one on stage, so one guy's describing it, someone else is building one from scratch on stage, takes them 15 minutes. They start taking requests from the audience for molecules. So the first one is an ADHD drug that is in short supply, Vyvanse. Because of problems with pharmacy benefit managers, there's a supply chain crash there. And if you're on Vyvanse and you go cold turkey, you have like seizures and stuff. It's not good. So they start making Vyvanse, and they're like, who else has got requests? So it's an information security conference. So there's a ton of trans people, and they're like, estrogen, testosterone. So they're making tea, they're making estrogen. And then they make the hepatitis C one-shot cure that costs $500,000. And then afterwards, I congratulated this guy in his talk, and he gave me his business card. And it's a little Ziploc bag with a piece of photocopied paper in it that says, this business card is an abortion. And you turn it over, and there's a full medication abortion, the 2 pills that he's made in there. The cost of this stuff is pennies. And, in an environment in which we are facing increasing supply chain shocks because of monopolized intermediaries, pharmacy benefit managers and others, wholesalers especially, pharmacy wholesalers are really corrupt and really screwing up the supply chain. And where insurance companies are passing on giant costs to people, and people are choosing between life-saving drugs and groceries or rent, and in which the ability of people to control their own fertility is becoming increasingly threatened. Democratizing access to pharmaceuticals is a moral imperative, and this was one of the most incredible demos I've ever seen.
Apropos question from Zach in New York. How do you define a monopoly? Thanks, Zach.
Yeah, so there's like a kind of one-step definition, which is like a monopoly is one seller, right? But in economics terms and policy terms, we call something a monopoly if there's pricing power. So pricing power broadly means that if you raise prices or lower quality, you don't experience a drop in sales. And that means that you have market power. And so, a monopsony, which is, formally it's one seller, it's the same thing. If you lower wages, you don't experience a drop in suppliers or workers willing to work for you. So it just means that you've got control over the market, and your market is not what economists call contestable. It means new firms can't compete but on price or on quality because you've got some market power. So the goal of anti-monopoly law from like 1890, when John Sherman, who was a senator, Tecumseh Sherman's brother, created the Sherman Act, he said, if we're not going to endure a king over the affairs of Americans, we should not endure autocrats of trade. So the goal of anti-monopoly law from that period until the Reagan era was self-determination, economic self-determination. And when a firm has the power to prevent that, then it is a subject of anti-monopoly law. And maybe calling it a monopoly is speaking loosely. Maybe it's part of a cartel or an oligopoly or an oligopsony.
That's what I was thinking of, yeah.
Yeah, but what we care about is market power, not like market structure. If you have a market with 100 firms in it, but one of them has 99% of the business and all the other firms exist at its sufferance, that is still a monopoly, right? And so it doesn't really matter how we, whether there's just one firm. So we can use more precise terms like oligopsony and oligopoly.
Or call it monopolistic, because
or we can call them monopolistic. But, the entire economics bar and or competition bar, antitrust bar, and the economics profession understands this usage. And, it's like it's a term of art. And so it would be kind of a self-own to say, like, because what you end up saying is not monopolistic or oligopolistic. What you say is oligopolistic, which you may understand as monopolistic, but is formally oligopolistic because Meanwhile, your interlocutor's eyes have glazed over. So this is a way to lose fights by being overly concerned with semantic correctness.
Here's Tom from L.A., again, appropriate to the context that we're talking about. Breaking up a company like Apple would greatly reduce ease of use and security for users specifically. What is the tangible benefit for users? Most Apple users just want it to work and don't really care. Thank you, Tom.
This is both an article of faith and a logical fallacy. So if most Apple users don't care about the ability to install apps independently or the ability to get independent repair, then we can allow those two things to exist and no one will use them. Right? The only reason Apple takes such extreme measures, so they killed 18 state right to repair bills. And they uniquely, among manufacturers, when they take in electronics and declare them beyond repair, rather than allowing them to be harvested for spare parts, they uniquely shred them so that they become immortal e-waste. Right? Apple does this because they understand that their customers do want to have more options, right? And so you have to get into a no true Scotsman fallacy where it's like, well, if you don't want to buy your apps from the App Store, then you shouldn't have bought an iPhone. You're not really an Apple user. Only Apple users like me who like my iPhone the way I like it are really an Apple user, right? So clearly, neither Apple nor policymakers believe this. And the only way I think any Apple user who's happy with the status quo can believe that Apple users are happy with the status quo as a class is to say all those people who would use a service that was available under other terms are not really Apple users. As Steve Jobs said, you're holding it wrong, right? Remember when we had the iPhone 4 and it just wouldn't accept a phone call because the antenna was misdesigned. And Steve Jobs said, no, the antenna is fine. You're holding it wrong. So if you believe that all those people are holding it wrong, then yes, you're right. But I tend to think that the definition of an Apple customer is someone who bought something from Apple, not someone who bought something from Apple and agrees with you. On the question of what security benefits we get, you're right that Apple has brought some real security benefits to the system, but they've also brought some real security detriments. So in China, Apple worked with the Chinese state to remove all privacy tools from the App Store. And the fact that you can't install apps from third-party stores means that once Apple decides the Chinese state should spy on you and kidnap you and torture you and murder you and imprison you, you are defenseless. Apple then took away end-to-end encryption in their cloud provider, and they did auto-sync to the cloud provider so that the Chinese state could spy on people. And then when a popular movement began to organize using airdrop in China to spread information around in advance of the last party conference where the mandate of Xi Jinping was renewed, Apple nuked airdrop in their phones. Here in America, in 2021, Apple rolled out an amazing feature in a new version of iOS where with one click you could opt out of commercial spying by apps. And 96% of users did this for Facebook and the other apps. Now, presumably the other 4% were drunk, or they were Facebook employees, or they were drunk because they were Facebook employees. And so Apple users clearly expressed their desire for privacy. It cost Facebook $10 billion in the first year, according to their investor call, which, you love to see. Facebook's surveillance is disgusting. But at the same time, Apple rolled out its own internal surveillance program for its phones that was secret and which they lied about when they were caught doing it, and that feeds their own targeted advertising system. Exactly the same data that Facebook was gathering for the same purpose. So a walled garden is very nice, right? When you're in a fortress and the warlord has got mercenaries standing on the walls defending you from the barbarians outside the gate, that's great. But when the warlord locks the fortress doors and the mercenaries turn around, you are defenseless. And so what I say is give the people inside the walls a key so that if they don't like the walled garden, they can leave. And then the warlord has to live up to their promises or lose their business. Let Apple make us secure, not by depriving us of the opportunity to choose someone else's products if we feel that they have failed in their duty, but rather by actually having to contend with the possibility that customers who are dissatisfied with its conduct will have a low-cost way of making that conduct felt in a way that directly affects Apple's bottom line, and that will discipline Apple so that they treat us better.
You ever think of running for office, Cory?
No, I don't have the attention span for it.
Well, you've got a pretty extensive attention span. I was just thinking about, you must do a lot of reading. I mean, obviously, because of the kind of activism and role that you've taken and the strong positions that you have been a proponent of. Do you feel pain when you're reading, or are you too engaged in the reading too?
Reading can be good for my pain, can distract me from pain. I subscribe to a couple thousand RSS feeds, and I have a couple hundred tabs in a tab group I open every morning. And then, I read and review. I just did my annual roundup. I think I did about 30 books last year that I read and reviewed. I probably finished about 50 books, and I started probably about 250 books. One of the most liberating things that I did was start putting down books that I didn't like well enough to finish.
And still have enough time to be a loving father and husband.
Yeah, I hope so. I think my wife and daughter would tell you so.
Well, that's the testimony we need to hear.
Yeah.
Or want to hear. Just a final question from Sam in Phoenix. He wants to know, there's a lot, so you started talking about migrants. He says there's a lot of talk about population implosion. Is immigration part of the solution? Maybe the world is having enough babies, just not in the right places. Thanks,
well, it is definitely the case, right? That if you were worried about the absence of young skilled workers, that there are a whole lot of young workers who would be capable of developing skills or who already have them who'd like to come in. It's not very fair to the places those people are coming from, right? I think that if all of the kind of extraterritorial nonsense that the U.S. had done in Central and South America were undone or were remediated, that most of the people who are coming at the southern border wouldn't be coming at the southern border anymore. And taking all the best workers and most skilled people and the most adventurous and brave people, because, speaking as the son and grandson of refugees, like, refugees are the hardest working, bravest people in the world, right? They're walking across continents to get somewhere. They're enduring things that people like you and me who, our worst moving experience was that time the movers said that they wouldn't get our stuff off the truck unless we wrote them a check for an extra $500. They're doing stuff that we just could not do. And when they land near you, you have like a superhero in your neighborhood who is going to do amazing things. Taking all those people away from their home countries is not good for their home countries. Figuring out what to do about population decline, it's going to be a big challenge. And I think that the people who are automation optimists, I think, have their optimism misplaced. I think even if we automate away a lot of the work that we have, we're going to have to relocate all our coastal cities 20 kilometers inland.
Well, I was thinking, you mentioned coastal cities, all those places that need population. I mean, the stretches of Montana, for example, or up in Canada, there's a need for workers who have the kind of resilience and work ethic that you're talking about.
Sure, but we have jobs on the horizon, right? There are cities and probably even states that are toast, right? Saving all of the people in those cities, building somewhere else for them to live. Right, we've put so many therms in the ocean. Again, second law of thermodynamics is not up for grabs. We've put so many therms in the ocean that we're going to lose the polar caps in large measure, if not entirely. Our low-lying places, which are our most populous places, are toast. Right? It is too late. I'm a science fiction writer, not a fantasy writer, which is why I don't think we're going to save those cities. We're not going to build seawalls that are high enough. The Thames estuary is gone. Right? So someone's going to have to move the Houses of Parliament, the Tate, and everything else that's sort of south of Camden Town out to Zone 4. And that's a big labor-intensive job. And no matter how much automation we have, we're going to have full employment doing that. At the same time, we're going to have full employment dealing with zoonotic plagues because we're going to lose so much habitat. Right? And we're going to have full employment dealing with wildfires. And we're going to have so much employment dealing with refugee crises. Refugee crises are a labor-intensive crisis. Now, ideally, refugees can do a lot of that labor. but it's still like, I don't care how much we automate. You, your descendants, their descendants, and their descendants are going to have all the work that they care to do for every hour that God sends, no matter how long they live and no matter how hard they work.
On that note, let me first thank all of you who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And you can hear it on Apple, Spotify, or go to our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't become a member of the podcast, I invite you again to join by going to our website at graymatter.show. You can find previous episodes there, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me directly at mkrasny@graymatter.show. I want to extend thanks to the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya, and a special thanks to this week's guest, Cory Doctorow. Thank you, Cory.
Thank you. I had a really lovely conversation with you, Michael. I really appreciate that.
And I appreciate you, and I hope that the pain will be in the rearview mirror as soon as possible.
I think it's more like I'm just going to keep dealing with it, but I appreciate that.
And I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.